Hey everyone, and welcome to CCAG's Climate Conversations. I am Mitzi Jonelle Tan, a climate justice activist from the Philippines, and I'll be leading our conversation today. This week, I have the absolute pleasure of speaking with two experts known for their work on the front lines of the climate emergency: CCAG member Dr. Tero and TV presenter and Paralympic medalist Ade Adepitan. Thank you so much for joining me today, and you both have a lot of knowledge of how the climate crisis is impacting indigenous and local communities across the world. And so our theme for today's discussion is how we can ensure these marginalized voices are heard throughout global approaches to climate change. So that really just brings me to my first question. We're seeing a lot how when people talk about the climate crisis, everyone's always asking or saying, listen to the science, but the mainstream narrative always forgets to also remind everyone to listen to the people. Why is it so important to listen and amplify marginalized voices when talking about the climate crisis? What do you guys think are the consequences if we don't do this?
This is, of course, the question in many ways, because what we are really discussing is kind of a view on history and reality, in the sense that how do we know and what do we know about the current state of affairs, for example, in the context of the climate change. We could think about the way that science talks about how over 80% of world's remaining biodiversity is in the indigenous home areas. So clearly, indigenous communities are doing something that's contributing every day to carbon stability, biodiversity, and safeguarding something that's really, really precious and critically important. The other viewpoint that's much harder is that climate change, as seen from traditional and indigenous community viewpoints, gets often told through historical lens. Stolen lands, conquest, occupation, colonial history, that's not very wonderful to bring forwards in an easy manner, and yet it happened. I think one single thing puts this into the context that a lot of the gold that's in circulation today in global society has links actually to Latin America and the old gold reserves that the Incas and other indigenous societies had there. So in a way, the wealth and the conquest lives on today, and it's not something people want to often hear about.
You know, the science is important. Don't get me wrong. I think it's extremely important because the science gives us the facts. It gives us the hard stats to know what indigenous people have known has been happening for decades. They're the ones who see firsthand the changes that the climate is having on their populations, the rising sea levels, the unpredictable weather, and it's the stats that help us quantify that, and which the science gives us, and it helps us quantify that. But the only reason why those stats are important is because of how it affects people. You know, they are connected, science and people, you know, and we cannot talk about one without the other. And I also think what's so important is that we get across people's stories. It's the only way that someone who is living thousands and thousands of miles away or in the UK can understand what is really happening in the Solomon Islands. You know, I could come as a scientist or a statistician and say, you know, sea levels are rising by this amount, and you know, the last time the hurricanes had increased by this amount of strength or this amount of frequency. But it's not until you go there and you see that people have lost lands, people have lost family, people have lost crops, people have lost livelihoods, and they're starting to lose hope. You know, we are social species, and the way we connect is by seeing the impact and the stories of others. So I think it's so important. You know, I think we should start first and foremost with the stories of indigenous people, and then the science comes after.
If I could just echo with an example of what Ade was just saying, I think the personal experience that comes to mind is an Inupiaq elder, one of the Inuit peoples in Alaska, with whom I worked about 20 years ago. His name was Stanton Qatadak, and he lived in a small village called Unalakleet on the Bering Strait, or between North America and Eurasian continent, where the oceans meet, the Arctic Sea and the North Pacific. And he was rather old at the time when we started to collaborate. The point he was making was that he started to observe ocean currents and the ocean temperatures changing in 1972. That's the level of detail and early warning that he, who was living with his oceans and the seals and the marine mammals and fish as a kind of a almost, I think he had been harvesting for 65, 70 years by that time, knew already in early 1970s that something is going on. Just like Ade said, we would then learn in 1990s and 2000s what was the root cause of what Stanton was observing. But I think it's very important on the point of amplifying, and we tried to put this into a science paper as well with Stanton, that how much have we missed? That's one of the questions that is very, very relevant. How many early and subtle signs we have missed, and even now we might be missing, that are being observed in the front lines.
Mitzi, yourself, what's your experience? You know, in the Philippines, I know you guys have faced so many issues with the climate there.
I think it's exactly as you said, because the mainstream narrative of the climate crisis is, oh, it's happening 10, 8 years from the future. People forget that it's happening today. People forget that these numbers and these statistics are related to people's lives, and that's what we really have to change. As you both already mentioned, it's so important that we connect science and people together, because otherwise you end up with, scientific details such as the Philippines has the highest number of extreme weather events in the past 20 years. But if you just listen to that, you won't know that behind it, there are people like me who have grown up afraid of drowning in their own bedroom. You won't know that there are people like me who have seen their communities, their families, their friends stranded on rooftops on the third floors of buildings because of the floods that consumed their homes. And as Dr. Tero already mentioned earlier, we forget about the historical aspect of it, the colonialism, the capitalism, the oppression, the exploitation, because it's such a hard conversation to have. But it's so important to have it. Otherwise, you end up with a very white saviorist narrative, one that portrays marginalized voices, indigenous people of color, disabled communities, the marginalized people as either tokenized and presented as helpless, or sometimes even completely ignored and even silenced. And so we end up with, I would say, false solutions where you see things like, oh, we still have a little bit of time left to continue emitting, including in the global north, when really the global north especially should be cutting down emissions now. And I think these common harmful narratives are so persistent in climate spaces, even and especially in mainstream media, that I wanted to know what you guys thought were other common harmful narratives that you've seen around the communities you're part of or that you've worked with.
I think one of the narratives you tend to get is, well, first of all, there's a lot of ignorance between people from Western, more I don't know, communities, places like the UK, in terms of what really is happening in these countries, and the amount of emissions. I've often heard people say, well, in those African countries, they're emitting loads of greenhouse gases, so they're just as bad, because look at their huge populations. Why should we stop? They're not going to stop. Look at India; it's producing all of this. Look at the massive amount of greenhouse gases. But people, for instance, if I was to tell people about the Solomon Islands, it produces like 100% of the greenhouse gases, the total greenhouse global gas emissions in the world. Yet they're paying some of the highest prices. They're losing their islands because of sea level rising. So I think there's a lot of ignorance in what is really happening in these countries, that people haven't just they've not really, I don't know, I think people just need to educate themselves more. And I feel also that the scientific community and the indigenous communities need to come together a lot more and tell their stories as one, rather than scientists come out in their suits and say, this is what's going on and blah, blah, blah. And then they wheel out an indigenous person in a tribal outfit saying, oh, look, woe is me. They need to come out as a joint force and get their narrative out and get their story out together, connected as a joint idea.
Harmful narratives with indigenous peoples, for example, are often built around either the notion of noble savages. They know everything. There's flying carpets and magical wands and spells, and suddenly everybody will be either a shamanic wisdom keeper or somehow saving the planet. So, and of course, the classical studies of the Native American indigenous peoples and how they were portrayed early on in big films have really contributed to the, and even before that, from the images of how indigenous peoples were perceived rather than the actual human societies and the actual peoples in Africa, in the Arctic, and in all those, shall we say, remote parts of the empire that triggered the interest in the power centers. The other point that's really central to this victim idea, or to this harmful narrative, is the notion of, for example, in the Arctic, that they are melting over there, and the last Inuit on an iceberg, or the last Sami or Chukchi, and we have to save them, and we have to come in, or we can then dismiss them. Oh well, they are so few in numbers anyways, and they are doomed in any case. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of the what Ade was saying has to do with how could we communicate and get the narrative into a position where a lot of these communities, indigenous peoples, for example, are agents of change. Exactly. They are maintaining their food security. They are being impacted, but there are also massive solutions that are underway on rewilding, maintaining observational networks, safeguarding, as I said earlier, the 80% of remaining world's biodiversity, despite the things which are going on, and despite often the lacking rights or resources to do that work. And if we would center around Ade's solution on coming together with science and indigenous and, for example, African voices, one of the things that we should be doing in that is it's a wonderful idea, but one of the things we have to keep in mind is the lack of resources and access. So it has to be sourced well and co-created with indigenous peoples. Many people don't even know, just to conclude, that even in the wealthy countries like Canada or Alaska, many Inuit families are living in 4 families in a house, honey bucket toilets, extremely high levels of suicide, alcoholism, abuse in the reserves. And these are the real living conditions in the North. And yet we are talking about the most powerful countries in the world.
I totally agree. I feel so much that indigenous people from these communities are the forgotten people. They're the forgotten people in this crazy drive for progress that we have in our society, in our world.
Yes, exactly. And I feel like a lot of times there is this very stereotypical image of an indigenous person. I think, as mentioned earlier by Tero, that it is this image about Asian indigenous people or the Arctic or indigenous people in the North that don't fit that, image of indigenous people in people's minds, are often forgotten, and their experiences aren't as valued when they are, and they should be talked about and listened to just as much. And these stories are so important because often the marginalized communities have the strongest stories of resistance. And that's why I want to hear from you guys. What are your experiences with these communities when you heard them and realized, wow, that's something everyone should learn? And feel free to talk a bit about your work here if you want to.
I think some of the places that I've been to that I found just mind-blowing were somewhere like, for instance, Bangladesh, and seeing how the people have had to adapt to climate change there, and especially in the rural communities because of sea level rises, and just I mean, there's that stereotypical line of, you know, these people are so resilient, and, you know, they're amazing because they're able to survive these conditions, but and they shouldn't have to go through what they're going through. But what I just found fascinating was, you know, now they are having to build resources and take resources to the people. So I went to a part of Bangladesh where they were building floating hospitals. And I know floating hospitals are not new, but the reason being is if they put a hospital on any sort of land mass, it might not be there in a week's time because it will be underwater, or that land mass would have moved. So just seeing how these countries are finding ways to adapt to save their populations, and what they're doing with growing the I've got to try and remember it now. It's the plant in Bangladesh which they use to protect the country from storms, that grows in the
Are they mangroves?
Yeah, the mangroves. There you go. It's too early.
We have them here too.
Yeah. But it's just the idea of that there is the government have set up this team that when new land forms out in the Bay of Bengal, suddenly this team arrives, they get on a boat, they get to this land, and then they plant mangroves on this land, on this island, because they're trying to create natural barriers to protect their lands. So yeah, I found so many interesting stories, and not just stories, but just understanding that people from these local communities, they know they have the solutions to try and mitigate and slow down climate change. And we need to learn more about this. You know, same in Bhutan, I saw exactly the same thing in terms of what they're doing in with, you know, trying to they grow more trees. You know, their tree planting population has gone up by 72. Well, they've got 72% of coverage of rainforest in their land, and they're sucking up more carbon than they actually emit. You know, so there's so many things that we have to learn, and we can learn. And people think because these are not global superpowers, these countries are not up there on the top list, that they have nothing to contribute and they don't know what they're doing. But they do. And we have to take time to learn and listen to these countries.
Well, one of the things that really matters and has been really influential in my life was that 20 years ago, when Snow Change, the organization that I work for, started the work in Siberia on some of the indigenous observations of climate change, when they wanted to do that with us, there was a man called Vasily Robeck, R-O-B-B-E-K. And Vasily was at that time already a recognized scientist in Russia, but he was also an indigenous leader. And when I look at what Vasily was able to teach, and we were working together on trying to find solutions to these permafrost melt events. How do you safeguard nomadic communities on some of the most remote parts of the planet? One of the things that his life work showed was that there's the long view, there's the endurance. That's not getting stuck on this crisis or that success. It's a long, in some cases, like with Vasily's people, who are the Even, that's the indigenous peoples he belonged into. They have been around for, I don't know, 5,000-6,000 years in their home area in northeastern Siberia. And if you look at, and this will of course never do justice to the man, but if you look at what happened in Vasily's life, he was born in 1930s into Soviet Russia. He met with the big society only at the end of 1930s, and then his parents sent him to school, and he eventually became a professor in Soviet times, which was of course quite brutal on indigenous peoples. And in a way, we can see in his lifetime how he navigated within a very repressive system to safeguard culture, language, and indigenous ways of life. And then when the Soviet Union disbanded in 1991, he stepped forwards with the mechanisms to safeguard the indigenous land, life, and culture. And the summary statement that unfortunately he passed away in 2010, but the message that Vasily always said was that, look, humans and nature are not the enemy. We have to accept the fact that some human societies have forgotten this lesson, but these indigenous and other traditional societies have safeguarded and maintain still very unique links between nature and human societies in their specific ways. And that's what we should be listening to.
100%, I agree. For me, it was an experience in 2017 when I was able to talk to a Lumad indigenous leader. He didn't tell us his name because the Philippines is one of the most dangerous countries for environmental defenders and activists. But he told us everything that was happening in their land, how they were being displaced and harassed and militarized and killed. Then he chuckled and then he shrugged, and so simply he said, "That's why we have no choice but to fight back." Then he talked about lunch, and it was so simple to him, and I was just like, wow, it's so simple. We just have to fight back. And so that's when I really realized the need for that collective action, the need for that change in narrative where it's just, these people are, as Ade was mentioning, these people are people that can't be listened to, have nothing to offer, but there's so much wisdom and there's so much clarity in that collective fight, in that collective struggle for liberation, really for freedom, not just, climate, environmental justice, but really for people's right to exist, right? And I think that's so beautiful.
I think, Mitzi, as well, there's climate change is an existential issue, but there's an existential question we have to ask ourselves as well, and that is, what is our planet for? And I think for so many people, we've fallen into this trap, maybe because we've been put on this conveyor belt of, earning money. But for so many people, they feel that our society or our planet is simply for us to continually extract and take stuff and make profit from it. And I think we've lost the idea of why we're here and what the planet is for. It shouldn't be about just only take and continually trying to make profit and trying to exploit it for everything we can. Because yes, it's taken some people out of poverty, but we've seen with the evidence that science has shown and that the local communities have shown that this way that we're living is only going to lead us to disaster. We have to start and find a new narrative and a new story of what our planet is for. We have to teach people, the next generation, that our planet is not just about something we exploit. It's about something that is there for us to all share and to enjoy its abundance and to thrive on. And if we look after it and we take care of the planet, it will take care of us. It's no point in extracting millions of gallons of oil and being happy today and then creating huge climate catastrophes in 20, 30 years down the road and starting the cycle to the end of the human race. What's the point in having sunshine today and ending up in fires tomorrow? So we need to try and change that narrative of what is our planet for.
Exactly. And I think one of my pet peeves is I remember how I think there was some mainstream media that released something in the UK about how there were positives to climate change, and one of them was the Arctic ice melting would open up to new trade routes
Oh,
to increase global trade, and it's just that's exactly what we need to change. That's exactly what we need to do differently, and that's why we need to make sure that these marginalized voices are not just heard but listened to and are
mhm.
at the seat of the table. And so that brings me to my next question. What do you guys think are the different ways that we can ensure these marginalized voices are not just heard but listened to throughout global approaches to climate change?
I'm in a fortunate position of, being a journalist, a broadcaster, working in the media. I have a profile, so I try to use my profile, my position, to get these stories out as much as possible. And it's not always easy, to try to get the BBC to commit on a documentary on climate change was not easy. Because they're like, oh, it's doom and gloom. We're going to make everybody feel sad, and can you not do something but have some celebrities in it, or can you make it into a game show stuff? It's just everyone wants to sugarcoat these things, but I had to try and stay determined and focused to use my position to get these stories out. But also, I don't want it to just be about me. It's about empowering indigenous people and local people from local communities to get their own stories out there and push their own voices. Fortunately, we have technology in terms of the internet, in terms of YouTube. There are ways to get out there, and I think if you are in a marginalized community, you find ways to connect with people like myself, with people like Tero, and to use our platforms to get your stories out there as much as possible. I think anyone, if you're in a position where you have privilege, it's your job to use that privilege to lift up others.
Yeah, indeed. Very early in the year, I heard a very influential talk, or something that really made a big impression, by Uzodimma Iweala from Nigeria. He's also working now in the US on the questions of African and indigenous and other cultural processes, and he has spoken at the UN. But he gave, I don't know, a TED talk or a conference talk some years ago on the notion of African heart of science. And what the Uzodimma was doing was trying to portray and contextualize the fact that our form of science is just one of many. And in the northeastern parts of Africa and many other locations in Africa, they had things going on centuries before the so-called Western rational mind came into the big theater stage. And what the message from there is that something else is completely going on. How do we capture that, despite the fact that the big story on the global news feed every second now, it used to be every day when I was young, but oh well. How do we, in a way, would position that much in the way that Ade was talking about, so that the multi-voices and the locations would come to the fore? The difficulty right now in today's time is that we have so big tensions by certain countries and certain issues that we have taken a lot of steps back in trying to focus and actually pay attention to things like actual indigenous voices on these things. The last thing I would say, and I agree that we who are in the leadership position or privileged position carry a huge responsibility. And I'm a lead author in the IPCC, and we will be releasing in 3 weeks the huge report on Working Group 2 that will talk about impacts, adaptation, and vulnerabilities. So the question then becomes, who cares? Like, what will we say? And isn't it more of the same as we heard from the BBC thoughts on doom and gloom? And the only solution to that are real people from real places, airtime and resources for them to speak on their own terms. In the Arctic, and I will conclude here, in the Arctic, there was a person called Justice Thomas Bircher in the Canadian North in 1970s, which of course is a million years ago. Justice Bircher, who was my close friend, did one thing really specifically well in 1970s in Canada. They were trying to build a pipeline, a huge pipeline in the Mackenzie River Valley. And the government of Canada asked Justice Bircher to investigate the impacts. What did Thomas do? He actually went into every single indigenous community in the Mackenzie River for the first time ever and listened. He said, I'll stay on. I'll stay for 4 days or 2 weeks, as long as everybody has had their say. And eventually the pipeline was never built. And that led to a massive, actually the first indigenous rights movement in the world, with the settlement of the Inuvialuit land claim in 1984 and so forth. So when you look at Justice Bircher's work, I'm not advocating methods from 1970s, but I'm trying to say that there was one single thing that he succeeded on when hundreds of years of British rule in Canada had failed. He actually sat down and listened, and building on that evidence, he then determined his recommendations to Prime Minister Trudeau, the father of the present Prime Minister. And that pipeline has never been built. And there are now indigenous rights ratified all through the Inuit area and the Gwich'in area.
Tero, I was born in the 1970s, so I can confirm that good things do come out of the 1970s.
Likewise, likewise.
Mitzi, don't even tell us when you were born. You're going to embarrass us at how young you are.
I can't relate. I'm sure there were amazing things that came out of the 1970s. I think the disco times for that time, right? With the flower power.
No, that was the 60s. That was the 60s was the flower power.
But no, I completely no. Sorry.
Be kind to the old man you are talking to.
But actually, in that note, I think that a multi-generational approach to the climate crisis is so needed, because right now a very common narrative is the whole young versus old thing, but I don't believe that. It's not the entire older generation. It's a very specific sector of the older generation, the fossil fuel industries, the multinational companies, the billionaires. It's not the indigenous older people. It's not you guys. It's not the normal older people. And I think that's another thing that we should be breaking down. Otherwise, it becomes like, it just isolates two groups that could be working together so well.
Yeah, I really wholeheartedly agree with you on that. And I mean, there's some frightening narratives that you hear that go around, especially over in the UK, when we've had protests from different groups like Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain, where people say, well, the only people who care about climate change are middle class crusties or educated people from the middle class. But and it then makes it sound like just if you come from the working class, that you don't care. If you're poor, you don't care about climate change. You're only just worried about what's going on. But actually, if you're poor, if you're struggling, it affects you even more. And so than other people. So yeah, we're everywhere where there is a narrative that tries to break us up in this battle against climate change, we have to fight against that and come together. We have to find ways to bring common ground between the young and the old, the middle class and the working class, all of the classes, because this challenge is something that affects all of us. we might be able to try and pretend that it doesn't, and there might be people who are super rich who think they're insulated and maybe able to surround themselves with a seal or biosphere of money to protect themselves from the change that's coming, but it's coming to all of us. And the only way we're going to solve it is if we all come together. So let's fight those narratives, because climate change affects us all.
If I may also offer some concluding thoughts. one of the really underestimated power that is still there is the arts. And despite the fact that most people don't read, or we are told many people don't read books anymore, I would like to take just a moment to recognize, for example, the work that has taken place by Chinua Achebe in Nigeria, from Nigeria. His work on Things Fall Apart, and the narration of how and what actually happened between the transition from a self-governing tribal villages into the modern age during the peak of the colonial era, what kind of choices people made, what kind of things actually happened. And I think Things Fall Apart by Achebe is a brilliant example that opened the door for, especially for a lot of Nigerian authors, but also the whole African women's literature that's now influencing. We saw in Joe Biden's presidential inauguration, the lady who was talking about the poetry and reciting this as a proud person who nailed really a lot of things as they are. Or if you look at last autumn and the Nobel Peace Prize, sorry, the Literature Prize winner, Mr. Gunnar, and his work on transitioning from Eastern Africa into the UK and belonging into two places, finding and navigating the space and time in these complex societies, they are actually a lot of the solution space, in my mind, at least for those that matter and those that are listening and perhaps reading. And the reason why I say that is that climate change will pose us the most important question, which is how do we simultaneously tackle everything that will change? And the only comparative experience probably that we have from human history is the colonial survival by African peoples, indigenous peoples, marginalized peoples, and so on and so on. And they survived. Let's celebrate their survival. Let's learn from them. Let's build on what they did. The unsung heroes, all the families, the grandmothers, everybody who somehow survived through the horrible times when the peak of colonization and these horrible things happened between 1850s and now, or 1990s or whenever around the world. That's in a way the map. That's where the compass will lie. And only by studying things like Achebe's works, Things Fall Apart, and many, many others, authors, painters, singers, theater people, community leaders, there might be a fighting chance. And that's why the arts should be playing a big role in our conversation on how do we build new society, better, more equitable, and the one that takes care of those voices that have been pushed aside for now.
You make me feel so emotional when you talk about that book, because my late father made me read that book when I was about 9 or 10, Things Fall Apart. And he's probably up there right now saying, I told you that was an important book. I told you, I told you.
And honestly, hearing these stories and getting to talk about these stories of resistance gives me so much hope and puts so much fire in my heart. And there's just so much love and joy and sense of community in these communities, right, that we don't talk about enough. And so if the BBC or any mainstream media ever says, oh, climate change is too doom and gloom, then listen to this, listen to these stories of resistance, listen to the marginalized voices, because there is so much love to be talked about and so much fighting spirit that we can learn from. And honestly, really, I am so grateful to the both of you for this insightful conversation. And thank you to everyone at home who's been watching. And I hope you found it as interesting as I did. I know I'm definitely going to look for that book. I've already noted it down. And so you guys should too. If you have any questions for Tero or Ade, then please do send them to the CCAG team on any of the social media channels. And similarly, if you have any comments with the new format or what you'd like us to delve into next, then just fire them our way. Until next time,